Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, je vous prie tout d'abord de bien vouloir excuser Madame Sophie Lougard, directrice de l'école des Ponts, qui, confrontée à un agenda particulièrement chargé, n'a pu se libérer pour ouvrir cette journée de la chaire Mobilisation prospective au service du développement durable. Elle m'a chargé de la représenter. Alors l'école des Ponts est très heureuse de vous accueillir en présentiel pour cet après-midi, organisé par les deux laboratoires de la chaire CIRED, de l'école des Ponts et le centre de mathématiques appliquées de l'école des Mines. Elle vous accueille dans ce bel amphicaco, en tout cas une partie de cet amphi, qui est le plus grand, du nom d'un de ses illustres anciens. Albert Caco est en effet un des très grands ingénieurs des ponts et chaussées du XXe siècle. Il est connu pour ses nombreuses contributions tant dans le domaine du génie civil que celui de l'aéronautique. On lui voit par exemple la structure interne en béton armé du Christ rédempteur sur le mont Corcovado à Rio, emblématique de cette ville que je pense que tout le monde connaît. Alors revenons à ce qui justifie votre présence ici en présentiel ou à distance, à vrai dire. Cette 13e journée de la chaire est consacrée aux enjeux financiers de la transition bas carbone. La récente COP26, rendez-vous incontournable de la communauté internationale sur la question climatique, a rappelé la nécessité de conserver les engagements climatiques de l'accord de Paris, en particulier la neutralité carbone. Mais au-delà des discours et des annonces diverses, l'enjeu central est d'accélérer les conditions de réalisation de ces objectifs, et notamment l'accompagnement financier des transformations socio-techniques requises. Il s'agit d'un enjeu central pour chaque pays, ainsi que pour la pérennité de la coopération internationale, en particulier entre pays du Nord et pays du Sud. Depuis de nombreuses années déjà, la chaire, comme plateforme d'outils prospectifs, constitue un lieu de réflexion et de partage avec différents acteurs, parties prenantes et communautés, autour des principaux enjeux de la transition à l'échelle nationale et internationale. C'est peut-être là le point le plus important de cet après-midi, éclairer les enjeux présents et futurs autour des questions de financement au regard des dynamiques de la négociation et à partir de là, faire émerger les principales questions qui sont adressées à la recherche et aux parties prenantes ici présentes. Le programme que l'organisation vous a préparé permettra d'abord d'aborder ces aspects de la question avec des interventions d'experts internationaux. J'en profite pour remercier ceux et celles qui ont concocté cet après-midi. Je salue en particulier les deux directeurs de la chaire, Nadia Maïzi du CMA et Jean-Charles Bourcade du CIRED, ainsi que leur équipe. J'en profite également pour remercier les partenaires de la chaire pour la confiance portée en ce projet, je dirais, dans la durée. Vous êtes en de bonnes mains pour des échanges de haute tenue, vifs et denses. Place maintenant aux présentations. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Alors, bonjour à tous. Bonjour à tous. J'ai le droit d'enlever le masque. Merci pour cette introduction. La première partie de l'après-midi va donc être consacrée à ce décryptage des enjeux financiers. Et donc, nous serons en partage à distance avec 4 spécialistes qui vont nous permettre d'appréhender différents points de vue de différentes régions du monde. Alors, tout d'abord, Dipak Dasgupta, je vais forcément écorcher les noms, qui est Distinguished Fellow au TERI. Donc, le TERI, c'est The Energy and Resource Institute, qui est situé à New Delhi, et qui était le premier conseiller économique du ministre des Finances en Inde, qui a été également membre du board du Fonds Vert Climat, membre du GIEC, et impliqué dans la rédaction des chapitres 15 et du Summary for Policymakers. Puis nous aurons une intervention de Yannick Glémarec, qui est président du Fonds Vert Climat, le premier fonds de financement multilatéral de la transition bas carbone. Ensuite, nous aurons Madame Nokuthula Dube, une experte zimbabwéenne en finance climat, et développement, et qui est également impliqué dans la rédaction du rapport du GIEC comme auteur principal du chapitre Finances. Et enfin, notre collègue Michael Grubb, qui est professeur en énergie et changement climatique à l'University College de Londres et qui est fondateur de Climate Strategy, membre du GIEC et coordinateur du chapitre 1 du prochain rapport. Alors tous ces chapitres sont bien sûr ceux du Working Group 3, consacré aux stratégies de solutions de mitigation pour les émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Donc ce que je vous propose, c'est de partager avec eux à travers leurs exposés. Donc on va avoir les 4 interventions, et puis ensuite on ouvrira à la salle un ensemble de questions-réponses pour échanger sur les problèmes. Donc je vais passer directement la parole à Dipak Dasgupta.
And you switch to English.
Ah yes, that's true. Okay, so Dipak Dasgupta, the floor is yours, and I think you don't have any presentation, huh?
No, I don't.
Okay, good. So please, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So the subject and topic of my discussion is going to be about macroeconomic context.
Sorry, we are going to solve the question of sound because we have a bad sound here. So maybe we need to improve that. Ouais, c'est pas très... C'est vrai, peut-être. Can you say something?
Yes, yes. So
No,
we're going.
it's not good. Non, mais on n'entendait que chez nous, non?
Donc il laisse un moment, c'est bon, je crois.
Okay, go. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I'll talk about the post-pandemic context. That's the topic, the macroeconomics of the post-pandemic context. I wish we could be talking about happier times, but it seems that our macroeconomics always deals with difficult settings and contexts, and it never seems to go away. So there are 3 points that I will wish to talk about. First is that although macroeconomics is primarily concerned about short run, there are long run consequences that macroeconomics should be worried about. And I'll talk about pandemics and their long run consequences. That's point number 1. Number 2, I will talk about finance and debt as a special part of the macroeconomic context that we are living in right now. And number 3, I will talk about immediate challenges on the macroeconomic side that we are facing. And these all leads up to the kind of actions that my other distinguished speakers are going to talk about. What do we need to do given this context? So let me get back to my 3 points on long-run impacts of pandemics first. So what we know of the econometrics and looking at the data on pandemics is that they don't go away very quickly. Some do, but many don't. And I'm thinking about the historians looking at it, or the econometricians within history who've been looking at episodes of past pandemics. They tend to have, we are thinking about the influenza flu incident that happened in the early 20th century. And we are thinking of even going back, looking at what happened at the Black Death in the earlier. Every pandemic is different from one another, and it is not possible to draw straight conclusions that this one will behave similarly to the others. And I'm only talking about the consequences, macroeconomic consequences. So that's just by way of referencing back to the episodes that we have. But some things we know from theory is likely to be the impact of this pandemic. So if you think about a long-term growth story, there are essentially 3 or 4 things that's worth worrying about. One is human capital. What happens to the stock of human capital post a long duration pandemic? Second is to think about investments. Is there physical capital that changes as a result of the nature of the pandemic? Third is to think about what happens to the labor force. And these all add up to the total factor productivity. So in a small, so if you have a mental map of where does growth come from, and you have these elements of the storyline of what drives long-term growth, then it is doubly the case that a deep pandemic like the one that we are even now going through in its third, fourth waves, it's going to be persistent, not just because of the health reason, but it's going to have long-term impacts that are probably going to be on the whole negative for labor and on the whole negative for factor productivity and negative for human capital. And that's the setting in which I think about it. So this pandemic is especially likely to be long-lasting and negatively long-lasting for growth and social consequences for 2 reasons. One is that this pandemic, unlike the others were probably more health impacts, directly health. This one has coincided with a macroeconomic shock. So pandemics which are a health shock combined with a macroeconomic shock are 2 reasons why we should expect to see and worry about the consequences of this beyond just the 1 to 2 years. The other possibility is that the other thing that we worry about, that of course we never quite recovered from the great financial crisis. So the point of intervention and inflection with this pandemic is also not a good one. The third reason to worry about it is that the world has moving away from a collaborative way of looking at things, and it's going into nationalism. And that's a terrible tragedy for the world just at the moment, because pandemics they cross borders. That's one thing for sure. And that's why you need to have coordinated responses. So that's my point number 1. This pandemic and its long-term growth consequences is not going to go away. It's going to be here with us for a very long time, decade. You should think in terms of decadal things. Second point is about debt and finance. What's happened to and this is a consequence, fragilities exist always. So there was a run-up in debt, borrowing by countries to finance their spending and priorities. It was happening prior to the pandemic. So the pandemic was just a sharp shock that came right at the moment when countries had already developed their debt was becoming a question in many people's minds. And with the pandemic, it has forced countries to mount emergency spending. And the problem is that it has created a divided world. There are some countries who can manage this debt better than others. And my storyline to you is that the consequences for developed countries are very different from the consequences for developing countries. And of course, while there are differences within developing countries, we know there is this huge divide between the two, and I'll talk about very briefly why that is so. So something that we know about is that when you think about developed countries, these are countries where you can switch from public to private debt, kind of like a mirror to each other. It's not a problem. That's the way standard macroeconomics work. So what has happened in developed economies is that the public sector is borrowing massively to counteract the consequences of the pandemic. It is showing up in large private savings. So in a sense, it's a perfect match as you would expect. And and it is in a context where there's large private savings and you have the central banks in place, which can carry out the classic or not so classic countercyclical monetary policies. And so the effect is that you have this combination that you have governments borrowing more and their debt exploding, public debt exploding, to finance the public expenditures that need to take place. But it is not a problem. It is not a problem in the sense that it is matched by a surge in private excess savings. And it is backed by central banks that are implementing, and it was doing quantitative easing before, adding on to the standard interest rate. Now they've added negative interest rates to the policy arsenal. So that's perfect. You can drive debt much higher if your interest rates are low. So it's not just the level of debt that matters. Can you do accommodative monetary policies? And the conditions in the developed countries are perfect for that. In fact, the debt rising from 80 to 100% of GDP or more, 110, it's not a problem. Japan has been doing it for decades. They can financing it, and that debt level is not a problem if you have excess savings, quote unquote, excess savings in the economies. And the second thing is, if you have exceptional privilege, if you can run a currency without any threat from the rest of the world, and you have exceptional privilege because it is the currency of choice in financial and markets, and there are two currencies with relative exceptional privileges. There are three, in fact, but certainly the biggest one is the US dollar, the second is the euro, and the third is the yen. And there is no, renminbi comes along once in a while as being touted, but these are not. It gives you an additional freedom of action. Now that's the developed world. Debts are rising. People are worried about the impacts of the sharp rise in debt that's happened. But largely, I don't believe that's in the nature of a problem. When you turn to developing countries, we are in trouble. The reason we are in trouble is they don't have any of those preceding things that we talked about. They're not high savings. They need inflows of resources on the whole, and it's showing up. The consequences are showing up, which is that we already knew that there was debt distress. So their aggregate levels of debt have climbed from 55% to about an expected 65%, the same 10 percentage points of GDP, but the interest rates that they're having to pay is about from 5 to 10 times higher in real terms. And that's because they face this wall. They cannot be. So the spreads are rising. The borrowing costs are higher. The capital is being pulled back. And so they are in deep trouble, in debt distress. One of the first things that happened in this side is the crisis that we saw in Lebanon. For years, Lebanon had problems with its debt. It finally went. And we see the consequences of what happens when you have that kind of a meltdown. But it's much bigger than that. Right now, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are 7 debt defaults which have already happened. There's another 33 countries in debt distress. IMF and World Bank and others are publishing the data. The last June data, if you look at the list of countries, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa are in deep trouble on the debt side. And this is everything from Ghana, one of the big borrowers in the sovereign markets, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda. So I don't want to name countries, but the sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, big trouble. But it's not just sub-Saharan Africa. It's all over. Brazil has a public debt to GDP ratio. Luckily for Brazil, it's in local currency, so that protects it. It's crossed 100%. And they're in the middle of this raging pandemic and need to spend public money. So they're in trouble. and I shouldn't really be talking about individual countries, but as macroeconomists, we are forced to talk about countries. We are in, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Argentina, whether it's Brazil, the big players, whether it is even South Africa, we have the big players. And I should say that in India too, we are worried, not worried about debt levels, but we're worried because, again, local currency borrowing protects you. But these are consequences which are going to last long. So what debt does, it's the classic problem of finance, which is asymmetric. When you're depending on the rest of the world for some amount of financial flows, when you hit a patch of slowing growth, and that's when you need the money, finance should be countercyclical. That's what the classical textbook story is. Finance helps us to smooth shocks. That's the role of finance. Unfortunately, in my published papers, I've shown that finance, cross-border finance, is destabilizing. And it is actually pro-cyclical. So when a country's growth slows down, or it has temporary balance of payments problem, that's when money leaves a country instead of coming into it. And so and the effects are asymmetric. When times are good, money comes in at a relatively good pace. So when you don't need it, the money keeps rolling in. When you're desperate and you need it, money goes out, and it goes out at twice the speed than the speed at which it's just coming in. And therefore, it causes these periodic crashes and long-lasting impact. So that's on debt and finance. The real effects are, of course, much worse. We have jobs disappeared. We have trade and tourism that has not recovered. We have commodity markets in trouble. We have poverty rates are much higher than we ever thought it would be. We are all talking about pre and post pandemic, and the public finances, the need to spend more on critical, essential things, quite apart from climate. And so we are very far from where we need to be, not at a good point. So that's my second point. In debt and finance, we need some instruments to change this action. Third point is, immediately we have a problem with the consequences of rising energy prices. So these are things that add fire to the fuel, adds fuel to the fire. Right at a point that they was hoping for a smooth coming out of the crisis of the pandemic, we are seeing another kind of effects of things. So what should we do given all these contexts? I mean, the rising energy prices impacts are also adding pressure to inflation consequences. So just at the moment, when we needed a little bit of calm, it's done that. So what do we do? So I'm going to stop very quickly. And my other speakers will talk about the solution space that they think about. The biggest opportunity, if one thinks about it, is a massive coordinated recovery. The world needs this, hasn't been used, and we wonder when that obvious instrument is going to be used, with massive support to low-income countries. That'll be good for the low-income transition, good for the world recovery, which will otherwise stall, quite likely stall the recovery that we were seeing. Very soon it's going to stall. So that's point number one. This coordinated recovery is an option, but at the same time, the news is not very good, because we were told that there was going to be an SDR allocation of 650 billion. SDR issuance of 650 billion, that it was going to be equivalent to a Marshall Plan, after a size which would be bigger or equivalent to the Marshall Plan recovery post-war that Europe saw when Europe was helped out by the rest of the world, including sterling reserves from India, which was coming to Europe at that point of time. Unfortunately now, the story is not good, because we don't know what happened to the 650 billion SDR issues. They were allocated to the highest income countries. And they said there was going to be voluntary reallocation. Voluntary reallocation never happened. So we don't seem to have the right signals that could have been done so easily. There was an expectation, strong expectation, didn't happen. So so the coordinated recovery has an issue. And we seem to be stuck with national priorities, not international priorities. And second, Europe. Europe is turning into Fortress Europe. It's an aging society which doesn't know where it wants to go. It thinks it can find solutions within its walls. Good luck to them. The problems, if you don't deal with it, will appear on your front step through natural gas prices or through your borders with other countries. It's going to show up. And it's much better, easier to deal with in a cooperative way. And Europe needs to do that because it has the largest aggregate savings and wealth in that terms. And there was a moment post-war when Europe was on its knees and it needed help and it got it. It's time that Europe understood what its role needs to be. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very clear message to Europe. And now we will listen to the point of Yannick Glémarec. So Yannick, I'm going to share your presentation.
Many thanks, Arantxa. The building on Dipak presentation, I will move us from macroeconomics to microeconomics. And I will try to discuss the role of environmental public policies in removing barriers to climate investment. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah. That's perfect.
And this presentation basically is based on a recent publication from the Green Climate Fund, Scaling Up Climate Finance in the Context of COVID-19, which was prepared by a team of IPCC author and GCF climate specialist under the leadership of Jean-Charles Urcade. So Jean-Charles, please feel free also to intervene at any moment in the presentation. Starting maybe with COP26, whether or not COP26 was a success depends very much on the type of metrics you decide to take. If you take the actual policies and action, COP26 has not changed anything. We are still on course for an increase in global average temperature of 2.7 degrees Celsius, in line with the SSP to 4.5 from AR6. Now, if you decide to take as your metric the net zero emission targets that have been taken or are being considered to be taken by close to 140 countries, COP26 was an immense success because for the first time we have a level of target that bring us below the 1.8 degrees Celsius threshold. So at striking distance of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. Next one. So let's take a look at this net zero emission targets. The good thing about them is that they cover 90% of the global emissions. No. The bad thing is that most of them are basically political statement of intent. They are not actual plan. The 73% of them do not provide specific sub-target nor indication about how this will be achieved. And basically the future of the world right now depends on whether or not we can translate this long-term strategies and net zero emission targets into actual action. One thing that we know for sure is that this will require a dramatic increase in climate finance and will require investment in different type of asset classes. The range of money, the range of finance needed varies from about $1 trillion to $4 trillion annually. That's the type of finance we have to mobilize to translate this net zero emission targets into reality. If we were able to do that, to link back to the point of Dipak, this basically will have also a tremendous positive impact on our capacity to address most of the macroeconomic barriers that he has mentioned, and in fostering a green climate resilient recovery from COVID-19. As Dipak has mentioned, this money is not to come from public coffers. In developing countries, the idea of non-orthodox monetary policies to come up with trillions and trillions of dollars is not to work. Therefore, the money will have to come from investors. Is it possible? Next slide. On paper, yes. We have trillions of dollars of assets earning a negative interest rate in G20 countries. And we have, according to some estimate, $26 trillion of investment, attractive investment opportunities in climate infrastructure, the bulk of it in developing countries. So normally the money should go from negative interest rate assets toward this attractive climate infrastructure investment opportunities that have real economic return of anywhere between 4 to 8%. It's not happening, so it seems to be a macroeconomic paradox. The reason why it's not happening, next slide, is that's because money does not follow only a reward gradient. Money follows a risk-reward gradient. And if you have the impression that if you invest in climate assets in developing countries, you risk to lose 100% of your capital, you are much better off actually to lose a tiny little bit of amount of money with negative interest rate assets in OECD countries, rather than taking the risk of losing 100% of your capital. Where does this perception of risk come from? It's come from a number of political, macroeconomic, business, technical barriers. For example, if in order to get your sitting license for your solar park, you need to get the authorization of 27 different agencies, you will think twice before doing it. Or if you do not have enough, if you do not have the required port infrastructure to import your wind turbine, you will not invest in wind turbine either. And so we have a number of barriers that basically increase the risk of delays, the risk of cost overrun, the risk of failures of project commissioning, and this is a barrier to capital flows from negative interest rate assets toward potentially attractive climate investment. Next slide. This is certainly the main issues of climate finance today. It's basically, maybe clicking on it, basically how do we address, how do we remove these investment barriers? There are two schools of thought. One of them is that's the school of thought that dominates debates when you have, for example, meetings of ministers of economies. And it's very much correcting the price and risk signal. And through, for example, carbon pricing mechanism, you will basically fix the market. You will adjust a little bit the market through correcting the price and risk signal, and therefore you will have carbon pricing mechanism such as carbon tax, and you will promote climate risk disclosure. You have another school of thought that's clicking on the slide, which is basically market shaping, sectoral policies. And here the idea is to come with a different number of policy instruments, such as, for example, feed-in tariff, in order to create a demand and reduce the risk for the supply of projects. You have for this, in terms of market shaping, you have something like more than 5,000 policies, environmental policies that are currently in action in the world. The dramatic growth in renewable energy technologies can be directly linked to market shaping policies. And so basically you have often these two school of thought: carbon pricing versus sectoral policies, market fixing versus market shaping. The experience of the Green Climate Fund, next slide, is that actually the two school of thoughts, the two approaches can be mutually supportive. The sectoral policies can reduce the level of carbon pricing needed to have an impact on the market, and similarly carbon pricing can further support the role of sectoral policies. And I would like to take a theoretical example to illustrate why these different type of instruments can be mutually supportive. Let's imagine that we have a high carbon project, coal-fired power plant. That's the curve in red. And that we have a low carbon projects, solar park. That's the curve in green. And and there, this graph shows the cumulative cash flows over time. The climate projects, low carbon projects, basically have high upfront capital cost, high capex. And it's costs 2, 3, 4 times more money upfront to establish a solar parks and a coal-fired power station. But in exchange, they have low operation and maintenance costs. You don't have to buy fuel. They have low OPEX. High capex, low OPEX is not a problem when the cost of money is relatively low, like in OECD countries. In developing countries where the cost of money is extremely high, as mentioned by Dipak, the lower OPEX cannot offset the cost of the higher capex. You pay a fortune in interest rate, and therefore your green project will not be profitable. It's profitable in OECD country in a low financing cost environment. It is not profitable in a developing country in a high financing cost environment. Furthermore, because you're speaking about something new, a new type of technology, you might discover that there is a policy gap that prevents you from importing some equipment, or that the technology does not work as you were thinking, and therefore you might have delays in commissioning your project, and you might have a lot of cost overrun until the moment basically you reach a danger zone where your banker decide to cut one's losses and to let you go. And so you can this can lead to the abandonment of the project or even the bankruptcy of the firm. So if I'm a rational investor, here I have a green project that is basically attractive, profitable in France, suicidal in a developing country, and I'm not to touch it. The next slide. So what the role of carbon finance and climate risk disclosure with the role of carbon pricing? No, going back to the slide before.
Oh, sorry.
No, slide before, the other direction. Yes. So the market fixing with carbon pricing, you come with a carbon tax. And so basically you lower the return of your red projects, your high carbon projects. And with climate risk disclosure, you demonstrate to investors that actually it's much better to invest in a low carbon projects. Therefore, the interest rate that they are asking for is lower. And so suddenly your green projects, thanks to market fixing, becomes much more attractive than your red project. However, you have not yet resolved the issue of cost overrun. And if I'm a rational investor, unless the carbon tax is extraordinarily high, $100, $120, $150, something that is politically unacceptable, unless my banker is an enlightened individual and dramatically reduce the interest rate on green project, I'm still not to touch that project. Next slide. Now, here, if you bring market fixing and market shaping policy instruments together, and so, for example, if you come with some upfront de-risking instruments such as project development funds, you can dramatically reduce the risk of a cost overrun endangering the entire economics of your projects. And so if you have a cost overrun, it does not endanger the financial viability of your projects. And for the first time, with a carbon tax, with a lower interest rate and upfront de-risking, I have a green project in developing countries that is financially attractive. And if I go to the next slide, and if in addition, I developed new investment appraisal methodologies that mainstream climate, physical, and transition risk into the appraisal process, that's how suddenly my two projects can start looking like. And here, if I'm a rational investor, so I will go for the green project. So why is this example? This example is to show first that maybe the divide between market fixing, market shaping, between carbon pricing versus sectoral policies, it's something that's we should go beyond. That's one thing we know is that to de-risk investment, environmental public policies often are synergetic, and we should not hesitate to use different type of instruments. And another thing that we have learned with the experience of the Green Climate Fund is that we will never end up using the same instruments. Barriers to investment are specific to each country, and the type of environmental public policy instruments that you will need will also be specific to each country. And so one of the main challenges of sector practitioners who want to catalyze climate investment to convert the net zero emission into reality will be to find the appropriate portfolio of environmental public policy instruments to improve the risk rewards of investment. My last slide. In practice, how does an institution such as the Green Climate Fund try to do something like that? We have adopted a four-pronged approach. The first one is that we provide grant money to countries to enable them to put in place a conducive policy environment for climate action. It's up to them to decide what a conducive policy environment means. And for that, we provide $1 million in grant per year per country. One thing we know for sure is that a country that's with a complete policy framework will be able to attract significantly more money than in a country with an incomplete policy framework. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, it's 7 times more money. This is particularly important right now because we need to ensure that there's policies that we put in place to address climate change also foster a green climate resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we have today a unique opportunity to ensure a green climate resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic if we bring together climate change and macroeconomic concerns. The second approach that we take is to catalyze innovation. The days where basically policy, technology, financing innovation were to be transferred from the north to the south are over. Most of the innovations that will be required to catalyze finance for climate action in developing countries will have to come from developing countries because, for example, they have been able to leapfrog a number of different technologies because they don't have the legacy infrastructure, the legacy institution that OECD countries have. The problem is that climate innovators in developing countries do not have access to technical assistance to refine their business model, do not have access to finance to develop functional solutions. And so what we do right now is that we support incubators and accelerators, and we develop specialty financing instruments for early growth. Now, once we have a functional solution, we need to, after, mobilize money at scale to establish a commercial track record. And this commercial track record is critical because bankers cannot deal with uncertainty, but they can deal with risk and they can price risk. So with a commercial track record, suddenly your bankers can start figuring out whether or not they are to finance a replication of a given new climate solution. Now, to mobilize money at scale to establish a financial track record, we basically do what we call blended finance. So that means we basically use public money with private money to de-risk the financial investment. So what we can do, for example, is that we can provide guarantees to bankers for financing the project, or we can take first loss equity position in private equity fund. So we add to the policy de-risking instrument, financial de-risking instruments. And so once we have a track record, once our bankers are able to price risk, they still need to be able to access finance to support this kind of the widespread adoption of this new climate solution. And another thing that we do is to basically help domestic, public, and private institutions to access domestic and international market through the issuance, for example, of green bonds. And so that is a practical application of a theory that's of a theory of change, which is that you need to develop unique portfolio of instruments in every single country to remove barriers to climate investment. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much. So we will continue our journey around these different questions around finance, climate, and post-pandemic. And so Nokuthula Dube is going to share her view, and I will share your presentation. No, it's not. No, it's right. Yeah, okay. I was lost in the menu, and it's here. So here we go. Oh, you don't have the micro open?
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Arantxa. I'd like to share with you some thoughts around localization approaches to climate change, building on what my colleagues have mentioned, Yannick before me, as well as Dipak. Next slide, please. So, as we know, developing countries face the challenges of climate impacts and meeting sustainable development goals. And they are, of course, the least prepared for COVID-19 and the most vulnerable to effects of climate change. I think that we've heard about the challenges this presents, but I think we can also look at the fact that there are opportunities here amidst those challenges, and in our mobilizing funds and resources. So, for example, we know that the current financial markets in developing countries need strengthening as part of the responses. And this also has embedded inside it the innovations which some of those Yannick has mentioned, and I will build on in my discussion. We also have an opportunity, I think, to build on the current sort of the technical institutions, the scientific approaches, which would benefit from strengthening collaboration, would benefit from better open access to more and better climate data, modeling and early warning systems. And I think that we can look at enhancing the responses through improvements in mobilizing local actors in particular, through partnership, through technical assistance, through capacity building. And these are critical elements of strengthening the responses, as Yannick also highlighted. Next slide, please. So building on this, I think that we've heard the fact that developing countries are coming to this discussion looking for resources, looking to mobilize the resources. And I think that one important element also to remember is 100 billion UNFCCC Copenhagen commitment, which has yet to be met. And I think that's very important. And the COP delivery plan spoke about prioritizing grant-based finance for the vulnerable, for the most vulnerable. And that's very, very important because, as we shall see from the discussion, this plays an important role, not just in the de-risking that Yannick mentioned, but in strengthening the regulatory environments, the policy environments that are critical to producing an enabling environment for developing countries. The other thing that came out of the COP discussion was some announcements from the multilateral fund, the Climate Investment Fund, talking about coming to the market and using the strength of its balance sheets, the strength of its project portfolios in entering the bond markets and looking at earmarking something like 50 billion 50 billion in investment grade bonds, which is potentially useful, and only the results in time will tell how that materializes. But it's an interesting idea we should keep an eye on, because that's being earmarked as looking to not just mobilize these markets, but equally to kind of accelerate clean energy and sustainable infrastructure in developing countries where we do have trillion level gaps in infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at strengthening responses, we've spoken about strengthening the regulatory environment, strengthening the policy environment, but we can look at also strengthening the financial markets and the banking institutions that make up the local ecosystem in developing countries. In particular, if we look at some of the instruments which Yannick mentioned, such as bonds, we know that, for example, there's potential in those domestic markets for us to support and mobilize some of those bond issuances and look at developing different types of bonds. I mean, there is a variety, there's a legion of ways in which one can structure bonds and structure the risk to appetize a diverse set of investors. And of course, we know that the universe of developing countries is not homogeneous. So there will be some countries, which my colleague Dipak mentioned, for example, that can immediately have capacity to mobilize some bonds. And I think this is important because for domestic markets, you have small, medium enterprises, you have state enterprises that all need financing and local financing. And one of the challenges, which was mentioned earlier by Dipak, for instance, is the Eurobond issuance by developing countries, which has come into the market, which is very, very expensive. And of course, with these high levels of distress that sovereigns are now facing and holding high interest-paying Eurobonds, I think this is a good opportunity for us to reflect in terms of local markets and the domestic markets, and what can we do there, what can we look at, and how can we borrow less perhaps, or use the borrowings that we have domestically, because I think there's significant potential in our asking, how can we innovate a little bit better and stimulate innovation, as Yannick mentioned, in terms of the financial instruments, in terms of the investment products that are specifically tailored for local populations, because there are different players in these markets. We've got local players. We've also have diaspora populations, which is perhaps sitting in OECD countries and other regions, who are they are investors themselves, participating in the economies in their home origins and so forth. So this is very important in our looking at how do we strengthen the financial markets? How do we strengthen the bond markets in these local ecosystems? And the 100 billion that we mentioned, the 100 UNFCCC on a grant basis, these are some of the things which are important, which could be mobilized, which are non-market based, but are equally important. Now, if we look at that table, just very quickly, we can see that we have the green bonds that Yannick mentioned, we have the transition bonds, and this reflects the fact that they are different in different geographies with different climate impacts. You need different instruments. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So different countries and different developing countries, we have to look at their ecosystem. We also have to look at their just transition pathways in terms of perhaps their taxonomies. And we know that developing countries in general are carbon-intensive economies. So these are all needs finance, some kind of grant-based financing to support these kind of activities. And in developing these local markets and in strengthening these local markets, we also look at how can we better stimulate innovation of these financial instruments that will help us manage the different types of risks, but not just managing the different types of risks, but equally investment, because there's a huge appetite as well for investment projects, for investment products. I mean, as Dipak mentioned, the macroeconomic conditions are distressed at this time, but we must look beyond the short time horizon. We also need to look at the long-term horizon, and these developing countries have young, growing populations and growing economies. So yes, there is the short term and there's also the medium term on how do we manage these levels of distress for different players. But I think that we mustn't forget that these markets have local domestic markets that we must continue to nurture for the long term. This is where the salaries are being paid. This is where we have local projects and the investment projects that Yannick mentioned. This massive opportunity for these projects. It's just that we're not yet mobilizing the financing to where it's most needed. And I would support Yannick's position, which is that if we can structure the risk return and look at the environment in which we're structuring the project and support it, there are returns to be made. Next slide, please. So I wanted to perhaps sort of pick out some examples to give you a flavor of some of the actors here. We've spoken about the domestic market. So when we talk about domestic market, it's not just the bonds that are in these markets, which are still nascent, which are still developing. There are also consumer products. And if I can start by giving you an example of Africa and give you a flavor of what Africa is. It's a billion population. It's a continent with a billion population, and mostly a young population. And yes, there is the story of the distressed debt. And I would argue that part of the solution here is our looking at how do we improve the domestic markets? How do we bring down the cost of capital in the domestic markets? How do we bring down the cost of credit? Because we know the cost of credit in developing countries, particularly in Africa, is very, very high. Now, if we look at a case study, this particular case study, I've picked a local fintech, it's called Flutterwave. Now, in this 1 billion market, another way to look at the opportunity is to say, well, it's a consumer market of 1 billion young people, as it were, who are frankly hungry for opportunities beyond the debt distress. And we must look at that. We must look at the solutions, and some of the solutions have been proposed on how do we manage that. But we mustn't forget that there's a significant opportunity sitting inside Africa with its 1 billion population. And the AfTA agreement, which was recently signed by nations of Africa, actually makes that a single union, as it were, a single trade. It provides an opportunity for companies for a trading zone. So if I speed up a little bit more and come back to the Flutterwave, this is a startup company which has received several multi-million rounds of funding from international investors, and is building a digital payment system across a number of countries. So with this idea of looking at Africa as a potentially a significant market, this is a small company that so far has something like 11 African countries on its platform, which is very interesting. And the reason this is interesting is that this is a platform that is a multi-solution platform. So what it does is this weather signaling that we talked about earlier, which is an opportunity in terms of warning systems. It's inviting these young, tech-savvy scientists, engineers to build us some warning systems, some climate warning systems. There's also opportunities there for diaspora remittances. So if you're overseas perhaps in the OECD countries and you're sending some money to your country of origin or and so forth, where you have connections and you have family, this is also a platform that can be used to send money. And we know that actually remittances are a very important source for developing countries, although we've yet to find ways of perhaps pooling those investments. And that would be something, again, to look at and say, what are the opportunities? What are the instruments that we could structure to harness these remittances? Because we know that remittances have actually kept families going through the COVID season, whilst this SDI at the macro level that Dipak talked about is being discussed. We mustn't forget that families still have to survive the COVID season, and the remittances have played a very, very important role. Now, going back to this flutter wave, this is one of the reasons why this is very innovative and interesting is because this is a bunch of science and engineering graduates with some finance training who've gone abroad and they've developed this company. Now, this is one of what we're calling an African unicorn because it's now valued at $1 billion. And this is just to give you a sense of how having the support, the incubators, the seed capital, which Yannick talked about, that's also very important in these markets because the credit is very expensive. So we do need the grant financing to come in play. We do need the incubators. We need the accelerators because they provide the environment to support and nurture these kind of unicorns. And I think that it's true to say within the Africa space, fintech, digital platforms is incredibly popular with investors, and that's attracting 35 million, 170 million. This company is, I think, has attracted something close to $170 million of funding, which in an African context where we have these challenges of risk perception, I think is very encouraging indeed. The same company has partnered with a commercial player like local Standard Bank, which is one of the largest commercial banks with a very strong presence across Africa. And these kind of partnerships are exactly what we are saying we need more of. We need the cooperation, because if you notice with just this one player, there's been a lot of players around it, the incubators that Yannick spoke about, the accelerators, all of these have been part of the journeys of these kind of companies in nurturing them through the course. And now we have a 1 billion valued company that's playing a very, very strong role. And if you look at Standard Bank as a player, that's developing consumer products and mobilizing finance. But remembering that this Africa is a carbon intensive, commodities focused region, we do have to look at low carbon transition plans in terms of the Paris Agreement and, of course, financing renewable energy. So these commercial entities are also entering the financial renewables. So I'm just giving you a flavor of how important it is to mobilize and partner with local players, because in terms of responding to mitigation, in terms of responding to adaptation and developing the different instruments, because with these kind of digital plays, there's also things like pay as you go, for example, for energy access, because remember, these are mobile footprint, and this is important in rural. Again, remembering that Africa is mostly rural. So the technology, the harnessing of the technology, the harnessing of the mobile space, the harnessing of the fintech, which is bringing in financial services, the science is very powerful indeed. And if we look at moving to the Standard Bank has now said to this company, actually, this is important for us as well in terms of payment. So small businesses are coming onto this platform. If I could move to the next slide, please. Now, if you look at how that journey is going, we started with a digital payment system that's got some warning systems that are being developed. We've got a commercial player that's coming in with some money, which somebody such as Yannick's GCF can partner with in terms of commercial players, because these are institutions with footprints on the ground. And if we look at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, that's a GCF climate finance facility as well, which is pioneering a green investment bank model and providing de-risking to lower the upfront costs, which has been discussed. This is, again, this is a very important instrument because it's addressing a barrier, which is limited climate finance instruments and a very high cost of capital in the region. And I think all of these things, if you look at the Development Bank of South Africa, this is active in the green bond market. This is also active in looking at different kinds of bonds. So these players are interconnected, and these players are developing the partnerships. And finally, just to finish with the STEM learning societies, I can't emphasize enough why that is so important, because these unicorns that we are building are coming from a science and engineering base and a science and engineering knowledge. And similarly, for institutes like African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, that's addressing capacity building and developing climate change modeling. And again, that's in partnership with an OECD government. So there's the importance, again, of international cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the last slide is just the references and the citations.
Yeah, I've said that. We've seen that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring speech. And I'll lead now Michael conclude the session, please. Michael, you don't have any slide. That's it.
I do, if I can show them. Is that okay?
Yeah.
If I project them from here.
I'll let you do that. Yeah. If you can share them. Yeah.
Can you see that? So I've subtitled this Remarks from a Non-Finance Expert. I work more broadly in energy economics than finance itself.
Sorry, did you share the slides? Or no, he doesn't have. Okay, good. Sorry. Go.
Can you see the slides?
Do you have slides here? I thought you were going to.
We can see the slide. I can see the slide, Michael.
Okay.
UCL is capping the climate investment trap in developing countries. I can see your slide.
Okay, great. So I thought I would do cover three things quickly. One is just some observations from a paper that was published in Nature Communications about the centrality of debt costs and financing costs. Make some remarks about the idea that I think has been touched on, will be discussed later, about underwriting risk facilities internationally. And then I want to just show a couple of results from some UK experience around interconnection. So first of all, I think all of this audience now will realize, but this is quite a nice graphic of the fact that the cost of capital does differ enormously across different parts of the world. And
Michael, sorry to tell you that we don't see your slides here. Maybe
some do, some don't.
Only other speakers.
The other speakers see them, but here the audience doesn't see anything. So
okay.
Either you send them to us, either you find another option in your menu that can allow us to see them.
Yeah, I doubt there's anything else I can do from my options. Do you want me to send them, or I could speak without them?
Okay. So
I'll just speak without, simpler.
Okay, just let you know that we don't see anything except you.
Okay, that's a pity. The slides are much more attractive. So this
user speakers can see them.
This work was called the Climate Investment Trap, and the central argument and analysis was that we need the largest amounts of low carbon investment, particularly in the developing world. But in many of those countries, the high cost of capital deters climate investment, less emission reductions. They're also more vulnerable to climate impacts. That combination undermines confidence in investment. It increases the perceived risks in many aspects, which of course then drive up the risk premium, feeding a higher cost of capital. And that's why we call this paper the climate investment trap. Now, in the absence of slides and time, I won't talk you through the detail. I can send the slides later, could be circulated for those who are interested. But we used a global model to look at the impact of different assumptions on the cost of capital, with a range of different scenarios of convergence on a global average cost over different timescales. Just to capture the range in this study was from about 5 to 11% weighted cost of capital. Obviously, at present, there are, as Yannick underlined, areas of investment with much lower returns than that as well. But we were looking at sort of country average returns from several years ago. And the essential result was that just changing the assumptions in the model about the cost of capital and the extent to which investment costs converged did have a large impact. We looked at many regions, but just taking the African results was that if the cost of capital converges rapidly, you could by 2040 roughly double the generation from low carbon energy coming in Africa because of the surge investment that would follow. It does take a few years, of course, for the investment to respond, but the results were quite striking and involved hundreds of billions additional investment. And as I say, this is a fairly standard and simple model, but it was really just a response to the fact that most of the global models, integrated assessment, assume a uniform interest rate. And that, frankly, is a pretty ridiculous assumption that doesn't capture one of the important dynamics in trying to decarbonize the global energy system. So, we just showed that even changing that parameter on its own had a substantial impact on results, particularly at the regional level. Now, to come on to my second area, I think this will be discussed a little more. One potential solution is risk underwriting, particularly at a multilateral level. So getting countries to effectively pool capital, not in the form of either grants or loans, but in a managed mechanism for underwriting the risks of private sector investment. And on the surface, that looks so attractive, particularly given the amount of money which is really got very low interest rates in northern bonds, particularly, and the needs, as Yannick and others indicated. The obvious question is, why is it not done? And this is a question I've been puzzling about. I've got some pretty simplistic answers. Others may be able to add more. But I think they split it a bit into the political and the technical and institutional. Politically, my sense is that, at least traditionally, neither developing nor developed countries have been particularly keen on this kind of idea. I think the emphasis in developing countries has been more on public grants for multiple reasons, partly framed by the 100 billion and debates about that being public finance, a sense of equity or reparations behind that, distrust of private investment, sovereign concerns about the strings that would come from private investment, and perhaps equally if that was underwritten by predominantly northern governments. But also, I think there's a lack of knowledge of the potential for that kind of mechanism of some international underwriting of risks. I think developed countries also have been curiously uninterested. Partly they prefer loans, and there's a well-developed architecture for loans and the institutions associated with it. I think there is a huge wariness in developed countries about creating any new institutional structures, and particularly for those around finance. Maybe also a political risk about public perception of public money underwriting private finance, and some of the scandals that can occur around some of these projects involving multinational corporates, for example. But for whatever reasons, there are some political factors, I think, why there hasn't been more progress. But also there are technical and institutional issues, the complexity of multilateral finance arrangements, how exactly do you determine the degree of risk underwriting and sharing, if you like, the metrics. That may relate to some work that Jean-Charles Lucade and others have done around the social value of mitigation actions as a kind of international index. I think also uncertainties on how to determine what qualifying projects would be, how to evaluate project level risks, and also the pressures and the tensions between international equity and the perceived risk. So obviously the clean development mechanism, a very pure sort of private mechanism in a way, and a lot of political concerns about how much of that money effectively went to the more developed markets in Asia. I think a final reason for hesitation is a perception, at least, of limited evidence about the effectiveness of underwriting. Now, one could point to feed-in tariffs and renewable energy contracts have been, hugely successful, and I think that's now widely acknowledged. But generally, it's difficult to separate in those kind of long-term contracts to what extent is that because of subsidy, as opposed to the sheer, financial security of the return, and they don't address all risks, of course, in international investment. So I thought as the third thing I would just offer is some remarks about one area of experience fairly close to home. I used to work part-time for the UK energy regulator, Ofgem, and in my time there we introduced a new regulatory model around interconnection with other countries. Interconnectors are physical wires that allow the transfer of electricity between countries, and there are many potential benefits. I won't run into them, this is not an electricity lecture, but there have been relatively few interconnectors, and there are very different models of how to finance them. Some were just a standard regulatory model, a bit like national transmission investments, which were kind of monopoly and regulated on a returns basis. Britain had always been in favour of a merchant model, which effectively says we want private money to build interconnectors based just on forecasts of how much money they could make because of price differences between the two countries connected. We actually then introduced, for complicated reasons, a sort of hybrid between those two extremes of full regulation or pure merchant market with a cap and floor. So effectively the regulator guaranteed a minimum return, but also a maximum level of profits that interconnectors could make. And the minimum, the floor, was linked to costs of debt. If I just run through, and people can look at the slides afterwards, it was really quite striking. This was introduced in 2013, became operational in 2014, this regime. Before that, Britain had just one interconnector to the continent, which was to France. We had two to Ireland and one more under construction to the Netherlands. All of those totaling 4 gigawatts of energy. Since introducing the cap and floor model, so this simply saying, the bottom is guaranteed, it's protected, but in return there will be a cap on the maximum profits. We've had 11 gigawatts of new interconnectors, 9 different projects, including stretching to not just another to France, to the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and just last month an interconnector to Norway, which is one of the longest interconnectors in the world, subsea interconnectors, certainly. So that's 11 gigawatts and an estimated £11 billion of new capital investment flowing directly after the introduction of this new regime. Just a couple of words about the numbers behind that, or the financing conditions behind it. By implication, if you have a floor and a cap, there's a corridor. The corridor was very wide, originally between about 1% rate of return at the bottom guaranteed minimum and 8% as the cap. And in fact, later on, that floor went even lower because it was tracking bond returns. So the corridor was very wide. The rate of interest started on those projects, we've tracked them, and they started around 5 to 6%. And I think one lesson is, even with these guarantees, it does take a little while for the financial sector to get more comfortable and confident and fully understanding this is an investment opportunity, a secure one, perhaps, for things like pension funds, if they're allowed to. So the rate went down from around 6%. The Norwegian link in the middle came in at 4.4%. And then Ofgem opened a second window for the most recent round, and the financing cost on those was under 3%. Now, just the 3% cost of capital buys you a lot of investment, very cost effectively. So I think that's just one area of just how much underwriting risk can affect the willingness of the private sector to invest, and to do so at much lower rate of return, because they're confident they can't, in the city expression, lose their shirt. So just some remarks of conclusion. I think it's clear from the previous speakers that the future of adequate international climate finance does need to draw on private finance at a much larger scale. I think despite the obvious apparent profitability now of many low carbon investments at a kind of, let me say, typically assumed rate of return, this is deterred by risks. And those risks are partly real, but they are often just as much perceived risks. I think the experience, and I've shown one major experience, demonstrates the large value of public risk underwriting in attracting such investment on good terms. And I think that if one could develop some kind of multilateral risk mechanism, the scale of potential investment in developing countries, and also I think the basis of international cooperation on such finance mechanisms maybe could have potential to help to address some of the post-COVID macroeconomic challenges that Dipak indicated. But I wouldn't deny or underestimate both the political and the technical challenges that need to be overcome. But I think it's about time we started really looking at those and trying to work through them. On that note, I will finish. And sorry if people couldn't see the slides, I'll email them after.
Thank you. I think it was completely clear and quite complementary with what's been said. So I have an echo. What's happening? Okay. Michael. Si je coupe le mien, plus personne ne va m'entendre. Okay, that's better. So I would like just to propose that we take 15 minutes in order to discuss around your different position. What I understood from the session is that the complex context of climate change has been emphasized by this pandemic we are stuck in, and that finance is one of the solutions that can be used in order to reduce the rising inequalities that has been emphasized again by this situation we're locked in. I'm rather interested by your commentaries, your views about what is really tackled when you speak about this low carbon transition. You are usually giving examples of assets, projects, but what do you think about this migration phenomenon that we are facing today, and the fact that if we let the different parts of the world be so unequal, then it's not going to be a climate change issue, but really a human issue that has to be solved. And I would like you to precise what finance can be, how finance can be used in this very difficult context. Because if you don't settle people in the places where they live, then I think the priority for the countries are going to be very different than what you seem to evaluate. Anybody wants to react to this? Nobody. Okay, so. Ils m'entendent pas?
Yannick.
Je t'entends, Jean-Charles, hein? Mais je vois que Dipak a levé sa main pour répondre.
Ah, ok, yeah, ok.
Non, micro. Micro. Mettre son micro. Vas-y. Micro.
Yeah, you have to. We don't hear you, Dipak.
So you want me to respond in a few things that I know about migration?
Sorry?
Did you want me to respond on the migration question?
Yeah. Anybody who wants to answer is welcome.
So all that I can say is that the hard evidence on how climate change, absence of faster development and climate change problems in developing countries is going to directly lead to migration pressures at the border in Europe or anywhere else. It's difficult to find that clearly as we might want an answer. It's not clear because what happens is that the migration process is a complex process. It takes place at many levels. The first kind of impact that you have is within countries. So the migration pressures that happen immediately is if you have famine conditions because agriculture is drought affected in large country settings or small country settings, the first migration that happens is from the rural areas to the cities. That's where and within countries, that's where the first migration pressures happen. And that it's a long process. People don't leave the settings in which they are that easily. If you think about households deciding to move, that's an incredibly difficult decision, but they will when the circumstances rise. Next one, it's very hard. So when we look at the evidence of how the next one is what are the pressure points at which then from the cities they cross borders and go to other places. And that becomes partly an economic challenge and partly the traceability. All I wanted to say is looking at the hard evidence of traceability from a narrow econometric causes and effects point of view, proven to be much more difficult than we think we could. So there's no clear, easy answer to the question. At the same time, mounting evidence that however this, we're trying to trace linkages between climate change and migration, which is at Europe, if you will. I mean, we're trying to see what happens if you have famine conditions in Madagascar, and does it lead to more migration there? The world doesn't work that way, unfortunately. The world works is you're going to see multiple causes, multiple constraints, and traceability may be a problem, but you're going to end up with the problem at your front doors. And it's much cheaper to address the problem, much more efficient to address the problems on climate change at the roots, as you were suggesting. So let me stop there. I think the traceability is an issue. The evidence, it takes a long time for migration to happen cross-border, but the pressure points, multiple lines of evidence showing up that when you get Central America in prolonged drought, that's part of the reason why you have border flows mounting, but it's not the only reason. I'll stop.
Okay. Michael, please open your microphone.
So just to add a bit on the positive side, potentially, if this is not wishful thinking. Of course, the original industrial revolution was founded upon coal. There's quite a lot of evidence that the availability of sufficiently low-cost energy is an important factor, certainly not the only one, but an important factor in economic and industrial development. So if we can speed up the diffusion of what are now relatively low-cost sources, in which actually many developing countries have some comparative advantage in terms of at least solar resources. Is there any prospect that that can become a material contribution to their industrial development, which presumably would help to reduce one of the pressures for migration? So I think there are some linkages between the climate investment issue and the question that you've raised as chair.
Okay. Wait, micro.
Just on this point, because some time ago there was a meeting in France and so.
Do you hear Jean-Charles?
Hein? C'est bon là?
Yes. C'est un autre micro qu'il faut que tu prennes.
Ça va? Non, alors. Well, that's simply to tell you that this question of finance, migration, and climate. Or 2 months ago, was a meeting in which somebody very well told me, well, finance is not enough because for me this was a vertice. So, engineer, I don't have to talk about that, but I understand that this is important. And the question of migration and finance is relatively clear. We have the most of the cities in the world, as said Dipak, is in our country, aging society. Okay? Investment needs, they are in the south. For climate, 70% of the investment are in the south. And in the post-COVID area, we have aggravated this gap. Okay? More savings in our countries. We don't know where to put the money, and less capacity to fund anything in developing countries. Look at that. If this persists, then we will have strong problems of poverty in the countries and strong pressure to immigrate. That's true. And the opportunity that we have is that because there is a huge investment gap in developing countries between 15% and 30%. If we bridge this gap by clean technologies, we can both narrow the gap in the world, and second, accelerate the low carbon transition. That's the challenge that has been discussed with this question of TERI scheme, mobilizing private capital, and so on. Because when you hear private capital, they are public capital in the south, obviously. But there are also private cities in our country. And that's both an equity and an efficiency issue. If the finance is purely a channel, the channel from savings to work with the rest.
Okay, maybe we can take one or two questions if there are in the audience. Yeah. Tiens, Jean-Charles, tu peux m'aider s'il te plaît?
Hi, do you hear me? So I'm Jean-Michel Crochet, an economist from the French electric utility EDF. So first, thank you very much for this presentation. It's very fruitful for me, instructive. So I will have many remarks, but I will focus on one remark, one question for Yannick Glémarec. So my remark, first I really appreciated his line. It's his line of reasoning about the finance, aligning finance with public policies. Because the first point is that energy transition is capital intensive, and all low carbon technologies, both on supply and demand side, are capital intensive with long lifetimes. Second, we need for that public long-term policies. They matter for the financing cost of energy transition. We could say that short-term markets, there are some kind of market failure on that. We need public long-term commitments, and in fact, the reality shows that when we have long-term, it lowers the financing cost. What is puzzling in Yannick Glémarec presentation is the example he took, because concerning wind power and solar PV, I mean, the reality today, both in OECD countries, but also in China, in India, in Middle East and South America, when we have long-term contracts following competitive bidding, long-term contract power purchase agreement for 10, 20 years, International Energy Agency shows that their financing cost is rather low, below, I would say, 5% in real terms. But so for wind power and solar PV, of course, there are barriers for the development, but not financing barriers. Barriers are in or other matters. But concerning other technologies, low carbon technologies, for instance, what I have in mind is on demand side efficiency. I mean, insulate, retrofit, building retrofits, and on the supply side for hydroelectricity, for fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, and for nuclear power, we need also this kind of long-term public. But it seems to me what is paradoxical that Yannick took the example of wind power and solar PV, but for me, for these technologies, it of course need to be developed. The problem is not for the moment financing cost. The problem is elsewhere. What do you think on that?
I took the example of solar technology and wind energy because it's relatively easy for people to. Most people are familiar with these technologies. It's true that today we have basically reached maturities even in developing countries. There are no finance at 98% by private investors. When I started my career, we had to use a portfolio of different policy and financial de-risking instruments to give them a fighting chance. You have to remember that in 2014, there was an article of the Economist saying that solar technology has no future. It's an extraordinary expensive technology and it's a waste of money. What did happen is that over the past 10 years, we have seen a drop in the cost of solar technology by 85%. Now, today the issue with solar technology and wind technology is not the incremental cost of the technology; it's the incremental cost of the financing. When the cost of financing is low, solar and wind technologies are basically by far the most affordable solution. When the cost of financing is high, they can still not be competitive. And the cost of financing is not only linked to the technology. You have other factors that can basically increase the cost of financing. But it's true that the type of efforts that we have done over the past 30 years to basically develop the renewable energy markets for wind and solar will have to be replicated for other type of technologies. And for example, one today that my fund is thinking a lot about it is green hydrogen. The green hydrogen, I started working on hydrogen technologies in the 90s, and there the joke was that hydrogen is a technology of the future and will always be the technology of the future. Today, you have some countries that believe that they can crack the $2 per kilogram price by 2030. And something like that will basically give us a long-term storage capacity for renewable, but will also give us substitution fuel for hard to decarbonize sectors such as steel and cement, or logistics, long haul freight such as truck shipping, etc., etc. And so it's true that some of the main de-risking instruments in the coming years will be in new technologies. We are almost wrapping up the work for wind and solar, and we have now to look at the technologies we need for hard to decarbonize sector.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. This is a general question, but how your work, your thoughts, your report is received by the concerned governments and banks, and how is it perceived? How is it perceived?
Did you hear the question?
It was not easy.
Oh, so the question is, how are your report received by the decision makers, policy makers, and what are the following?
In the case of the Green Climate Fund, actually it's quite unusual for us to issue reports. We finance projects. And the selection of the project is done by the countries themselves. So the bulk of our policy engagement is through the preparation of an actual project. So that I guess this question should be more addressed to Dipak or Michael, because Nokuthula is like me, I'm afraid. We are more in the business of engineering access to long-term affordable finance through actual programmatic initiatives.
Dipak? We don't hear you.
I was going to say I'd listen to Michael first and then come back to that.
Okay, nobody wants to tell us.
I was going to say I'll listen to Dipak first.
Okay, that's an answer. I think we understand.
I think it's early to say, but I think the fact that the Green Climate Fund, the sheer fact that it has come out with this report for an institution which, as you say, doesn't come out with many published reports, is in itself a good signal, and it says, and it's perhaps a bit of surprise to people that you're saying we do need new mechanisms to support the international finance required. And I think people may just be a little bit slow on the uptake, but I think some of the discussions that we've seen at COP26, the launch of the new negotiations, the fact that it's helped to get many of us more in the academic sphere really interested and more confident that we're actually working on something that maybe really quite sensible and useful. You know, although but change never happens overnight because of a report. It always takes you know, quite a while for ideas to diffuse and to get examined. But I think it's great from what I've seen, and my colleagues, a couple of colleagues here, you know, just they say it's a great report and really, really interesting.
Okay.
Let me add, if I may.
Deepak, he was going to
Just wait.
continue. Just please. Yeah, Deepak.
I think the report, it takes time for exactly the reasons that Michael said. It takes time for the idea to settle into the policymaker's mind, and they have a decision point they reach about how they're going to react. It takes time, but I think as the evidence builds up, and that's why we worry about evidence, as the evidence builds up to what GCF is doing, and it's not just GCF, it's actually countries using the power of grants and the financial system to grow, then it makes a big difference. So I think about the Vietnam operation. Am I right, Yannick? You had an interesting guarantee operation in Vietnam to improve energy efficiency. And if I may, just to add on that, the interesting part of that story was, here is the World Bank, which has massive resources available, and it comes for a tiny bit of grant money funding from the GCF in order to improve energy efficiency. And I'm thinking to myself, why does the World Bank need to come to the GCF? So it's for grant money for a tiny little amount. And then the story is a much bigger story. It's about grant financing, which allows Vietnam, not World Bank, Vietnam, to think about what are the options that needs to do on energy efficiency. And that affects $11.5 billion of energy investments throughout the country, potentially. Now that's big. So this kind of leveraging effect, as these examples come through within the reports. So it's about telling stories to policymakers. It matters and it makes a huge difference. So let me stop. Yeah.
I would maybe say a word. Why? Because I misunderstood the question. So if the question was specifically about the Green Climate Fund report, why did we decide to prepare such a report? Because as Dipak has mentioned and Michael, we are not an academic institution. It's because we wanted to start a discussion on how can you use $100 billion of hopefully public money in a catalytic manner to shift $1 to $4 trillion a year. Because that's the actual amount of money that we have to shift annually, and we were a bit concerned about the fact that often the discussion was only on one instrument. So, for example, carbon pricing, that's the solution for everything, or sovereign debts, and or blended finance. But blended finance, a very traditional form of blended finance, which was to subsidize interest rate. And this type of blended finance works only for mature technologies in mature markets. And so what our objective was to show that if we really want to use most of the instruments that we have, the one instrument solution will not work. Carbon finance in isolation, you will first will take too long, and you will have to reach a level of price that will be unbearable politically. The type of blended finance we have been doing for the past 20 years will not deliver. The leveraging ratio, it's basically 1 to 1.1 in climate. And so we decided to come with a publication to try to look at, to have a discussion on what kind of public policy instruments, what kind of combinations could give us a fighting chance to move from $100 billion to $1 to $4 trillion. And when we started having discussion with governments, we were quite concerned because, as mentioned by Michael, the discussion is between grant and loans, and basically we were saying the amount of money that we need, you cannot finance it with grants, and loan is not the solution, definitely not for highly indebted countries, and is not the solution in terms of leveraging ratio. So you have to use different type of instruments, such as guarantees, such as equities, private loss, first loss equity, etc. You have to come with new forms of blended finance. And also, ultimately, finance is parochial. The solution is in developing the capacity of national financing institution. So there were a number of messages that were going against the dominant wisdom, and to say the least, and which could have been badly understood if your lens is only grant or if your lens is only loans. Just try to look at the political economy of I think only about grant or I think only about loan, and this kind of language suddenly. And so we were a bit concerned, but to my surprise is that why often the first few minutes of discussions are difficult. Once we go down to the business of example, the reception was by and large extremely positive.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna take the last question of the session.
Thank you very much.
Speak loud, please. Yeah.
Vous m'entendez?
I suppose they don't, but.
Merci, vous m'entendez, no?
Yeah.
Do you hear me? It's okay? Thanks. I very much appreciate the new ideas, for me, the new ideas that you developed today. I think that it's important that people think that the territories will be developed by efforts of the territory himself, and not only by some kind of green fund that has been something somewhere in other part of the world, in the other context. So they have to make efforts to gain something that will help them and help others, because community activity. So I think that is positive. But I don't know if it is legitimate, if it is good to explain that sustainable technologies is a sustainable technology in any context. In some words, other words, when you produce solar energy in a desert, how to explain that is a solar energy, eventually hydrogen, when it is not used in the territory itself. If it is used 10,000 kilometers ago, is it a green technology? I don't think it's a green technology, it's a green prospect to explain that, to let that people think about.
Did you hear the question? Not really. Okay, no. I will summarize it in my way. The question is, are the funding given for the low carbon technologies dedicated to power this aging society in Europe, and the projects that are located in the south? Are they part of the targets that you have, as far as they're not dedicated to empower the territories in which they are built? So that's the question. How do you select the projects? In fact,
but in our case, we don't select the projects. Countries select the projects. Having it's we can only consider a project that has received a letter of non-endorsement by governments. It's and so regarding green hydrogen, you have, if we were to reach the price of two kilogram, less than $2 per kilogram, you have a number of applications that can be used locally, and why not to make it a source of income for countries? I see absolutely no problem with that.
Yes, but the hydrogen and the electricity is not transportable without many cost and many loss of the energy itself.
Yeah, the question is about the efficiency of the whole process. Like, it's a debate. I mean, you don't have criteria regarding the fact that the projects are profitable in terms of climate change itself in the places where they are developed. You're just financing because...
No, we are not just financing. I think it's there. I'm afraid we will go in a fairly technical discussion, but we only finance additional project. That means 30 years ago, if we had discussed climate finance, we would have been spending all our time discussing the concept of incremental cost, because at the time the technologies were more expensive, and it was everything was about offsetting the incremental cost. Today, the discussion is about additionality. I mean, making sure that we do not use public money to subsidize private sector projects that will have been financed by the private sector in any case. And so for us, when we have a number of investment criteria to decide whether or not we will support the project. One is whether we have a very strong country ownership, and that's essential to us. Another one is that whether or not this project will have significant climate impact, whether or not it will also support sustainable development, and whether or not it is additional, whether it is scalable, whether it is sustainable. So no, the public money can never be used like that. Any kind of public money is used in accordance with eligibility criteria. Dipak was part of our board. The negotiation of eligibility criteria is something that is always very intense.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we can conclude on this exchange. Thank you to all of you, and have a great day.